Welcome, everyone, to the Menttium Matters podcast, where we talk about leadership, life, and the transformative power of mentoring. I'm Megan Cummings-Kruger, and today we'll be talking with a clinical scientist and executive who's going to be sharing his perspective on leadership and mentoring. And it's a discussion I've looked forward to because he brings an exceptionally broad perspective to the conversation, which really is a result of his lifelong pursuit of learning, combined with a brave openness to continually stretch outside his comfort zone. His broadening experiences include his evolution from a technical individual contributor to business leader of many global teams, from scientific academia to the world of industry, as well as working in every possible size of organization, so ranging from the large corporate cultures to those nimble startups. And as we'll get into in this episode, he also brings a wealth of global experience, along with a rich dual perspective on the roles of both mentee and mentor. So with that, I am delighted to be able to introduce you to today's guest, Tim Meyer. And before we begin our conversation, I just want to share a little more of Tim's background with you. Tim has had more than 18 years of experience of global clinical trials and risk management in the medical device industry, preceded by an additional 9 years in academic research and teaching. For the past 2 years, he's held the role of Vice President, Clinical and Scientific Affairs for Bolt Medical. Previously, he served as Vice President, Clinical Affairs for Respicardia, Inc. for 4 years, and prior to that, had 13 years at Boston Scientific, where he held multiple roles of increasing responsibility. Tim has experience in all types of clinical trials, numerous publications in the cardiovascular and implantable device space. He's also gained rich global experience, including creating global clinical strategies, as well as building a clinical structure in the Asia-Pacific region. Tim holds a BA in zoology and history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an MS in physiology from the University of North Dakota, and a PhD in movement science from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. He currently resides in the Twin Cities area with his family. He is a valued longtime partner to Menttium. He first joined our community as a mentee, and he returned to mentor with us, and he's currently in his 8th Menttium mentoring partnership. He also participated in our pilot program of Women Mentoring Men. So he really brings a wealth of mentoring perspective to this conversation. And I'll just include one final example of Tim's focus and dedication, because it's always stuck with me. So I will share that along with the Ironman and marathons he has completed, he completed the Rim to Rim to Rim race, which is a 1-day, 46-mile run in the Grand Canyon. So with just that said, welcome, Tim.
Oh, thank you for the nice introduction, Megan. And those were a long time ago. So not in my near future again, but good experiences along the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as I just shared in the opening, one of the many reasons you are such a strong mentor is that you bring such a broad perspective to your partnerships on, as I went through, a number of fronts. And so I kind of want to start with a broad question of what are some of the learnings you've taken from this experience? I mean, I know this includes a lot of views, but what comes to mind?
I think that the main thing that, as I look back on my journey, how I really wouldn't be where I am today without all the mentors in my life. But early on, I didn't really think of them as mentors, right? They were either coaches, teachers, advisors through my graduate work. But then, came to realize that builds your network, and how fortunate I was, because I'm one of these individuals that I never had a 5-year plan. I didn't really know. I kind of knew what I wanted to do, but it just sort of happened along the way. And it wouldn't have been without the mentors in my life. And some of these were very serendipitous, interactions. Or I had a senior thesis advisor during my undergraduate degree. And after my master's, didn't know what to do. And he pointed me to his boss, his former boss, when he was doing a postdoc. And that's where I ended up at St. Louis at Washington University. And then I met my other advisor while swimming laps in the university pool. and just started talking to him, and I ended up in his lab. So, part of that is just, being old enough now to look back on how fortunate I was, and realizing that I could also hopefully contribute and help others based off of the experiences I've gained. So, Menttium came to me when I was at Boston Scientific when I was a mentee, and that opportunity was really good timing for me, and I had a really good first experience with a mentor, and just stuck with me that, hey, I was fortunate, so I'd like to give back and help others, depending on who the mentee is that I've been working with.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and one of the things I really appreciated hearing from you when we were talking about this podcast is just your observation of how important it is to stay open to opportunities. You touched on also when you have these friendships, mentors, networks, people that you are always connecting with, but also, I think in these times, a lot of times feel like there's some kind of a path they're supposed to follow. And there is a lot of talk of your 10-year plan and your 15-year plan. And my sense is you have had an extremely varied and fascinating career path, largely because you stayed open and stepped into opportunities that may or may not have stretched you, but certainly you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, to say the least. I mean, I had a mentor in high school that helped me kind of point me to what I wanted to do in college, but even that was kind of a last minute decision. And then it was just picking up the phone and calling the exercise science lab, and it was a new faculty member had just joined, and he's, sure, if you want to volunteer, I'm looking for it. And so it's some of it is being open to other people coming to you with potential opportunities, and then the other part is just also going toward some opportunities, make your own path, so to speak. But yeah, I've been really fortunate. One of my PhD advisors, I had no idea that his lab even existed. And so he just said, well, let's go talk. And, and then a couple weeks later, and that timing was perfect for me because I was trying to define what lab I was looking at and where I wanted my PhD dissertation project to go. And so some of it's timing and some of it is just being really open. And on the counter, and we'll get to that probably later, the other aspect of, I think, that was important to me from what Menttium brought to my world is, what is imposter syndrome? And I didn't know I had a syndrome until I heard it on a webinar, and that really hit me too. And so then I thought back to, like, how did I navigate my career knowing that I was reluctant in some respects, but it never fully prevented me from, moving towards some opportunities. And so, I just think being open, but then also charting your path a little bit, at least go in a direction and see what you can find out on your own. Those two things in combination have really led me to where I am now.
And I really appreciate what you just brought up. There are many that are listening that I'm sure are already familiar with Brené Brown and all of her research that talks about how important vulnerability is in leadership. However, there can be a lot of reticence, and I would say as a tendency, men in particular, where there's not as much discussion about the imposter syndrome. I think there's kind of a cultural bias that is put on men in this culture, certainly, that they should always, know what they're doing and always be confident. And so I appreciate, you've talked about this before, and I think it's such a gift for people to hear someone as successful as you, who's been brave and stepped into these challenges, has also struggled with what just about all of us struggle with at some point. Imposter syndrome. Does any story come to mind, or does anything come to mind for you as far as what has helped you with that over the years?
I think, prior to really hearing the webinar from Menttium, it was always more, I felt it was just lack of confidence. At different points in your life and your career, you may be more confident than others. And I think even getting through my PhD, I never saw that really looking back and saying, what an accomplishment. It was more of like, wow, I was really lucky to get through this. And, then you join companies like Boston Scientific and Respiratory, you're just surrounded by such amazingly talented and skilled individuals. And then you're back in that position. It's like, well, how did I get here? And then as you want to move into other positions, it's that, well, am I really capable of doing that? Do I have? And what's helped me always has been my network, my friends, my family that have reminded me of what I have done. And that's, I think, as you read more about imposter syndrome, those things are just so absolutely key to help you take on a new job or a new opportunity that, because my inner self is telling me that I don't check all those boxes and I don't want to fail, so to speak. But like I said, my mentors, this is where, I keep gathering mentors, right? It's not like I have one or two. I look at every opportunity to gather more. And those are the people you go to. But they're also the ones that bring opportunities your way. And just the fact that they bring an opportunity to you is telling me that, wow, I must be capable in their eyes, or they wouldn't come to me with that. And then my wife is we met in fourth grade and we share everything, and we'll go on a walk and I'll talk to her about these same self-doubt concerns of mine. And she helps me also realize that, you may fail, right? But if it's of interest and you're going to learn, then it's worth it. And so that's how I've been able to leverage all those key people in my life to help me move outside my comfort zone. And I'm so thankful. I'm grateful for that, because despite the difficulties with taking on some new opportunities, I've learned such a great deal, not just about therapy areas or new ways of doing things, but it's also about myself. And that has helped me, I think, as a leader, because I approach my teams, and when I have one-on-ones or even my peers and colleagues, I kind of look at the same thing. And I think other people may have concerns. Some are more confident than others, but if not, it's my job to help, support them, be constructive. And so, yeah, having a good network is more than just helping you find a new job or a new opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it is just I think it's helpful as I listen to what you're saying, and I know the audience is listening along with us. I have been so fortunate to be with Menttium for 16 years. So I have been able to really gain perspective on mentors, just an amazing group. Of course, there's so many things you can say about our mentors, but one of the common denominators that I find time and again is that all of you are very modest and very forward focused. And maybe those two go together, but there's always that love of learning, and that's that forward focus, and not so much that backward look at, oh, look at all I've done, and I think it's always helpful for people to recognize that the most successful people genuinely don't have that much of an ego, and genuinely are very modest by nature. The other aspect I wanted to highlight about mentors in general is that mentoring mentality. And so I want to take advantage again of your vast perspective on both sides of the mentoring relationship, because mentoring is something that I hear all the time from mentees and mentors, how the minute they learn something, they want to pass it on. It's just that mentoring mentality. You have had, just within Menttium, we're not even getting into all the places wherever you are working and you're mentoring formally or informally, but just within the Menttium world of cross-company mentoring, you've been the mentee in the regular program. You have been a longtime mentor, and you also chose to participate as a mentee in our pilot program of women mentoring men. So you shared with me in the past how what drew you to managing people, from your more individual scientific role to becoming a leader. A large part of what drew that to you is how much you do enjoy helping others develop. And I know by nature you tend to be very intentional and self-aware. That may be the scientist in you. But what I'd love to hear is, what have been some takeaways? What has come from these alternative perspectives that you've had over the course of your career?
I think that, being a mentee especially early in my career. And this happened right as I was making that shift from individual contributor to being a manager of people. And that was my first time managing my peers that so I moved up in that same group. And having somebody to just talk through outside of my manager or my director at work was just really nice, because it felt like a safe place that I could share. These are some of the challenges I'm anticipating. These are some of the challenges I've had. And that, mentor gave me a lot of just feedback and experiential examples. And that really stuck with me, not only as a mentee, but then how can I manage? So then you go in from report to leader. And so it helps you then think forward as being a mentor. I'm starting to accumulate that same experience that then I can pass down. I think just being a mentee, one of the biggest things that I appreciated the most was just, you have to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to share, this is where I'm struggling, because if you don't, then I think you close yourself off to, the opportunity to grow. And I see that in some of the mentees that I've had, right? You can see that some just, they don't really know if this is something for them. Are they really willing to share or open themselves up? And I completely appreciate that. So, I take it as my role to try to probe. And if it doesn't work for them, it may not be the right time. But I think that vulnerability then carries over as a manager as well. So being a mentor or a manager, I can try to elicit that from people to a degree if they're willing. And that then allows me to help them grow and develop. So I look at my own journey as a way to help others from both of those perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, it's been several years, I think, since the Women Mentoring Men program was piloted. But I'm curious because, as they always say, we don't know what we don't know. And that is a very broadening perspective, that particular program. What's a takeaway that you had from that experience?
Yeah, that was an interesting period for Menttium because nobody anticipated COVID. So a lot of our in-person live things became more virtual. But I jumped at the chance of this one because, I saw it as, I'm that demographic of a middle-aged white man that is what, there's privilege there. So I acknowledge it, I own it. And so I think all of my direct managers have been men. And that also shaped most of my mentors have been men. And so I saw this as a great opportunity to learn, get a broader perspective. And I had a wonderful woman, a Black woman. So for me, that was just such an enriching experience to have really open dialogue with my mentor, but then the broader group of female mentees. If you're willing to embrace that, you see a completely different perspective of the world. And I had an opportunity to do something else at a prior company, and it's just stuck with me since. So it gives you much more empathy, understanding, appreciation for what those that don't look like you go through, and what their challenges are. Not that they're all the same, but yeah, that experience was everything I had hoped it would be. And so I would highly recommend to people, as you're looking for mentors, don't just get mentors that look like you. And in the business world, oftentimes it's, the women in the workplace or females in the workplace, they're often, if you're a mentor or if you're an executive, and there's fewer of those in many companies, you're the one, oh, you should have her as a mentor. And that's really beneficial, but we should increase our or broaden our experience with different mentors, because you just don't want people that look like you or think like you, because what you want is diversity in experiences and perspectives. And that, to me at least, is how I felt like I could become a better leader. And it definitely accomplished that, at least in my view.
Yeah, yeah. I think you captured exactly what the power of mentoring is when you're able to be vulnerable and then also have such a different perspective. That's that learning point. If you're duplicates of each other, you're looking through the same lens and the learning is not there to the power that it is with that. I'm putting you on the spot here, but what is one thing that surprised you in seeing that perspective? I'm just curious. Does anything come to mind when you were in that role?
I think what was super impressive for me was just seeing how open and vulnerable the female mentors were, and really moving. I mean, just to hear the challenges that each one had progressing throughout their career, voices not heard, right? I mean, everything you can read in books, but it just becomes so much more human when you're sitting in a room hearing the paths that people take and what they're confronted with. It really changes your view, and then for me makes it even more like you want to help. You want to do the informal mentoring if there's not an informal, or just being aware, right? I think is at the end of the day that it exists, and that hopefully adds compassion and empathy and understanding, so that you can be an ally, an advocate, whatever word you want.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that. Another perspective I'd like to hear from, and again, it's one of those things that I think the nature of your work, you have worked globally for a very long time, which is wonderful. In the medical world, there is so much of global work. So it may be hard for you to think about, what you know now that you didn't know then. But for a lot of people, they're only recently perhaps starting to work globally. And of course, it's going to depend on where they're working globally. But what comes to mind for you as far as just something that surprised you or you observed, or a story, learning that came to you at some point working globally?
Yeah, there's when I think back to my early experiences, and I can picture some of my first trips, internationally for business, and you're like, wow, this is really, really cool. It's exciting. But for me, it was really humbling, because for me, in many cases, I can still picture being in the minority for me, really the first time. I could be in certain countries, smaller towns, where even my colleagues, that Italian or French colleagues, the physicians' English was just, it was not obviously their it was a second language, and I had to be really comfortable and patient with, and oftentimes I would say, go ahead and speak Italian or French, right? And so you have to be comfortable with silence, or being there and waiting for the questions to come. And you learn to be empathetic with the fact that, wow, I just take it for granted people speak English, and that's kind of the way, if you're not exposed to different cultures. And so just that exposure to different cultures was so helpful for me as a leader, because you learn that if you're on virtual calls, you've got to be sensitive and make sure that everyone has a voice to come into it. The fact I was so impressed with my colleagues that could speak 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 languages, and my high school French didn't get me very far. And I think the other skills that it, as I mentioned about just listening, is being an active listener, and you get to see different approaches to problem solving. We talked about diversity before. This just opens up, like, how do different people approach the same problem? And then, ultimately, I can hopefully help bring people together that are from different backgrounds, and that builds stronger teams. And I've just been super fortunate to be in companies that embraced that, encouraged it. And it's not just me either. I'm trying to balance my teams that came from very different cultural backgrounds. And then one other funny story, it would just, I think back to a couple of my former colleagues, that one was Italian, one was Spanish, and they would email each other in the other language. So as they practiced their Italian or their Spanish, I would be just trying to know the hello, goodbye, thank you in each of these languages. My brain's not very plastic anymore, so I get stuck if I'm going through 2 or 3 different countries. I'm processing, but it's really humbling, and I think it just gives you a much broader worldview. And most companies these days, having that worldview is going to help you in your career. So I definitely would encourage anybody out there, if you can get an assignment or work globally to some degree, it would be such a benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. As I was listening to you, it also occurred to me because, you're absolutely right. That active listening, I mean, that must have really strengthened that ability for you. But I was thinking also when it comes to communication, the styles and your shift from more of the academia, research, scientific, general personalities versus perhaps, the more corporate executive leader types, there can be a real difference, even if we just look at introvert, extrovert. I was just reading today about how 50% of leaders, 50% identify themselves as introverted. And certainly in this culture, that is not what people view as the typical, leader style. And so I was thinking that is an additional shift you kind of had to make throughout the course of your career is dealing with very different styles. Like you said something about waiting, and letting people process. That can be quite a difference. Am I right?
Yeah, and just you mentioning introvert, extrovert, I would say, I became more open, partly from I would consider myself more introverted, especially through high school into college. And part of that, I think, is still the imposter syndrome playing, where you just don't want to say much because you don't think you have the right answer. But I think that's the other aspect of business, and some of my graduate work, forces you into, you either have to get up in front and talk to people, or you're just not going to survive, kind of thing. But I for me, I'm not a very dynamic, I know some of my strengths, and I certainly know some of my weaknesses. So I'm not a real dynamic leader, but I think I connect well with, I'm probably, one-on-one smaller groups. And so I really relish those opportunities to learn, whether it's physicians or colleagues in other countries, being able to connect with them. But in many cases, you just have to be willing to be patient and not want to jump into the conversations, at least for me, and drive it. That's how you build relationships, or at least for me, that's what I've found to be very positive for me to build relationships, is connecting. And I try to do my homework on people, right? You try to be worldly in the sense of, I know what's going on in their country, because I find many Europeans and Asians that I've interacted, they know more about our country than many of my colleagues or peers do. But I still converse with physicians that I've interacted with from two companies ago. We still talk about what's going on, in their country or mine. And so I feel like that's added to my network, but it's just built relationships that have been really rewarding, because for me, work is always going to have a lot of, you're going to immerse a lot of time into it. But if you can build those relationships, that's what really makes it gratifying and makes me want to go to work every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I imagine all the stretching, being willing to stay open, and the empathy played big roles in, in being vulnerable in making those relationships, because it does. And we talk about this in mentoring, it gets personal, right? And that's that vulnerability can come. Everything we've been talking about as far as very different perspectives, different cultures, different genders, all of that difference also can lead to misunderstandings and conflict that we have to navigate through. And so I was curious, I kind of want to take advantage of, again, your experience as far as what have you learned around managing conflict? And I don't know if a story will come to mind, a positive or learning, but I would love to hear what you have found helpful to you in navigating through conflict.
So it's a really interesting question, because it has varied across my time, especially I would say management more, because kind of comes with the territory, but not all the time. I think this is something that I didn't have a lot of experience with when I came out of my academic experience, and being thrust into, especially when managing people. But I think my initial reaction was to delay it as much as possible, right? Like, oh, maybe it'll go away, or can I buy myself another day or two? And then as I became, I think, a more mature manager, part of it is just the time constraints, right? It's like I don't have time to delay. And the analogy I use is kind of like the storm's coming, you can either go into it or keep kind of trying to get around it or run away from it. And now it's, I try to take not a totally where it's not personal at all. It's just I look at it very much in a pragmatic perspective. It's something that's got to be dealt with. Align yourself with the facts or whatever, and have those tough discussions, but do it in a. So I tell my teams, my leadership style is kindness and respect. So that means you can challenge, you can have tough discussions, but it should be done in a kind and respectful manner. And so I think I've gotten much better at managing conflict by being open, honest, but still respectful. And it doesn't mean people are always going to agree with your decision or your interpretation of things, but that's how I feel like I've become much more effective at it, because I try to keep myself pretty level in all of it. It's not something that I enjoy a lot, right? Nobody does all the time, but it has to get done. And so you look at it, how can I do this in a manner that, hopefully avoids an argument, or can you do it in a manner that is the lowest burden for all involved, whether that's, with me or with a team or customers, whatever. And so I think that's how I've evolved in my way of dealing with or managing conflict, is just taking it as it is, and saying, okay, we've got to deal with it. It's not any more or less important necessarily than other things. It's something that's got to be done, but how can I do this and communicate in a respectful manner, so that people see that I'm a partner in that. And they still, like I said, they still may not agree, but that's my approach as it is now, always looking for other ways to manage it.
And I appreciate also that you were just also sharing that you also express your values, with your team. A lot of times that doesn't always get expressed. That kindness and trust, I imagine, really helps with how the team functions and what they can expect from you. Does an example come to mind as far as in the last few years managed through a conflict that went surprisingly well, or maybe just surprised you in general?
I don't know if there's necessarily, I mean, maybe those can go hand in hand, one that ends up going pretty well, even though you didn't know what the outcome would be. I won't necessarily go into specifics, but relating to people that we work with, there's there's a couple of examples that come to mind where it's tough when you deal with customers, and the customer's always right kind of mentality. But I went into a couple situations where I thought it was going to could get kind of volatile, right? Raised voices. And I think approaching it from kind of the fact-based, here's my perspective of the world, and trying to keep my voice low, right? Coming at from a respect, it diffuses the situation, because the emails that can start, everybody raises the temperature on that. But I try, even with my team, it's like if there's a disagreement right after one or two emails, you gotta talk live, or bring me involved if needed. But in these cases with quote unquote customers, I realized that if you can talk face to face live, oftentimes that diffuses it right then and there, and then you can get to the root of the issue, and how can you now solve it so we move forward. And oftentimes that builds some respect, that, okay, I stood my ground, and so now the other party knows that, things aren't going to be just a one-way communication. But I try to tell everyone, we want to be partners, and there can be tough discussions at times. That's fine. That's just part of how the world works, and whether I'm in business or not. But those two recent experiences like that, where I was, I guess, pleasantly surprised that there didn't have to be raised voices. There could be a common ground that we could placate both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciate, I think that's such an important observation that, I mean, you can really go down the rabbit hole with emails and misunderstandings, and to kind of nip it in the bud before it gets too deep in the hole. I would love to keep you here for the rest of my day, but I am going to let you go. But I have two final questions for you. And one is just simply, I see this time, these podcasts are kind of like collective mentoring, and it's a mentor's opportunity to share what's important to them, what they've learned, what they'd love to pass on. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you would like to share? I know I've been kind of peppering you with questions, but anything we haven't touched on that you'd love to share to future young employees or mentees?
I think, we touched on it a little bit earlier. It's just, really encouraging people to build your network, but think about what that network is there for. Again, yes, it may help you find a job down the road, but it's so much more than that if you invest the time into those relationships. My current job basically came from mentoring my mentors, but more than that, within my mentoring circle, there's different groups of those where, I may reach out to them for questions and answers, and they're also reaching out to me. So kind of becomes, long-term mentors become friends, right? And so I would just really highly recommend to those, especially the new people coming into the business, graduating from college, but even in college, doing the same thing. My daughter is now officially a junior in college, and it's the same things I stress to her. You don't know who you're going to meet and how that person may or may not impact your life at some point down the road. But I'd rather have more options and more opportunities for that. So build your team, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And again, it's kind of, again, what I've come to recognize as one of your life philosophies, which is staying open. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Last question, because I am a lover of quotes. So I always like to end with the final question of, do you have a favorite quote or motto, or do you have a favorite quote right now?
Yeah, actually, I was from a motto. You won't be able to see it on my phone, but my wife gave me a sticker that it just says "Be a nice human," and it aligns with my kind of leadership style of lead with kindness and respect. But being a nice human, I don't put it on my phone for publicity. It's just a reminder to me that at the end of the day, I can do that every day, no matter how crazy, my life is, my work is. You can always be nice to somebody. And, I just wish there was more of that. So from a motto, that's it. And then I have a few quotes that I leverage, but probably my favorite one, especially as I think about my work life, is the one that many people know from Maya Angelou, right? The people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but the one thing they won't forget is how you made them feel. And I just carry that with me in how I manage people, how I look at how I'm managed, because at the end of the day, what I do today to help the business move forward, what really resonates is, I think, people look at you and, do they respect you? Do they want to be led by you? Can they trust you? And that quote just, really sums it up for me, is I want people to feel respected and feel that, I'm invested in them, and it's true. And so that's one that I think about all the time, because you confront it in all your daily interactions, right? Like you'll leave a meeting and just wonder, wow, that wasn't great. And I'm more sensitive to it because I think about it. So it's also a challenge to me. How did I manage that meeting, or how did I manage that interaction with somebody? And could I have done better? And that's the same feedback I try to constructively give, my teams over the year. If I hear something, I'd like to challenge them and say, okay, do you think that person left feeling good or not, based off of that interaction? So that's a simple motto and a quote that I really feel helps me center myself.
I love that quote. In fact, that is my favorite all-time quote in my 16 years at Menttium for mentoring. To my mind, that is the best quote that captures the essence of it. So I love that. Tim, thank you so much for sharing all of your perspective, the insights that you've learned through the years. I have always appreciated in all the years, because of course you've been a longtime partner to Menttium, I've always appreciated your openness, and I would add courage in sharing the challenges, taking on the challenges when you stretch outside of your comfort zone. And I don't think we hear those often enough. And I will also add, I think it is such a benefit to be able to see through your eyes in discussing topics like leadership and mentorship, as well as considering, what's going to be a career. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I said it before and I'll say it again, Menttium has played a strong role in my life, opened my eyes to lots of things, and I appreciate everything that you do and appreciate the time. So thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. I also want to thank all of our listeners for joining this Menttium Matters podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with friends and colleagues. And if you're interested in additional resources, you can find our show notes on the Menttium website. We look forward to having you join us for our next inspiring conversation.